Okay, Florida's natural environment is so important to all of us here. People that visit Florida, people that live here, you grow up. We're talking before we went live about how you grow up in Florida and you're on the water, you're at the beach. When the environment is threatened or there's not an effort to protect it, it hits at the core of every Floridian. It's the reason why we have a massive tourism push here. We have no income tax because we have such an attractive state. It would be a shame that that be threatened. We just got hit by multiple major hurricanes this year, which exposed some certain weaknesses that local government's working on, which is really great. But today I have Dawn Shirreffs. Dawn Shirreff or Sheriffs?
Shirreffs.
Sheriffs. And she is with the Environmental Defense Fund. Welcome to the show, Dawn. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me and having this conversation.
It's a super important one. It might be the most important one. When you peel back the layers, if we were to ignore the environment here in Florida, ignore the wetlands, the coastlines, ignore the effects of these storms, we'd be in a pretty dang bad position. So what exactly what does your organization do, and where are the efforts concentrated here in Florida?
Sure. So Environmental Defense Fund is a global organization. We've been around since 1967, and we're really focused on bringing scientific and economically sound solutions to big, hairy environmental challenges like climate change. Here in Florida, we focus in pretty discrete areas. So one is we look at resilience, making sure we can get nature-based things like mangroves to help us combat sea level rise and to absorb storm surge in hurricane events. We also focus on energy. We think that we have an energy security problem because Florida is 75% reliant on imported natural gas for all of its power, which has some risk associated with that. And then we also look at EV fleets. So, for example, helping school districts secure federal funding for electric school buses, which are healthier and long-term, much more cost-effective for our communities. So we really focus on getting policies that support things like that. Did a lot of supportive work on flood disclosure for homeownership, because you talk about radon or you talk about lead when you're selling your home, you don't necessarily know if it had been flooded before. That's now law, and so we want to make sure that we have informed and educated buyers, especially since 900 new folks are joining the state every day.
It's an amazing number. And it's a number that does threaten this whole thing we have here, right? I mean, our state isn't that huge. It's not like we're Texas. We have water on three sides, right? We have multiple barrier islands. There's not a lot of room to cram the people in. Most people want to live near the coast. We have to be really diligent about where people go, how these communities are developed, how the environment's going to be protected along the way. Because we're not going to put up a wall and keep people from coming to Florida. They've been doing that for a long, long time.
Not a literal wall, but we will see the market start to correct itself with the types of impacts we're seeing on homeowners insurance, right? If we continue to put homes in harm's way, if we're placing development in ways that increase our state's risk, then we are all paying the price for what are proving to be prohibitive insurance rates for lots of folks that are seriously starting to consider whether or not this is still affordable as an option for them.
Well, there's data that's already came out that says there's hundreds of thousands of people that have already left. Yep. And the main reason is affordability, like you just said. It's not like it was even 5 or 10 years ago, pre-COVID. There's an incredible demand right now. There's low supply. And then you have this coastal issue, this flood zone issue, this insurance issue that's totally exacerbating the conversation about housing. So what may have been affordable 5 years ago, not even just based on the purchase price, just based on the carrying cost, especially in coastal areas, forget it. So there's data. I want to say we put up an article about it. Maybe it was from 2023. Do you remember that, David? It was like 400,000 people left Florida. Now, we still had a higher net in migration, so more people came in than they left. But the number that had left jumped significantly since the insurance crisis and COVID, since the demand issues. So it's a real issue. So for the Environmental Defense Fund, the way you're advising policymakers in Florida, EDF, if I can say, right? Does the Environmental Defense Fund, does the EDF, do they compile data and then show it to lawmakers? Like, how are you literally getting these initiatives moved forward?
Yeah, we do. So oftentimes it's making it visible. We just this year produced something called floridasclimatefuture.org. And if you can pull it up, you'll actually see there are some maps that we've created where we're looking at the impacts of climate change in Florida, not the impacts to polar bears in 100 years. We are talking about the impacts right now and in the next 2 decades. So we are already experiencing and what those cost. Because if you can't connect the dots to affordability, it's a harder thing to explain. So I know you mentioned, coastal, but actually we are seeing a whole bunch of flooding happening inland as well, right? And so what does that look like? And this will unfortunately need to be updated in a post-Hurricane Helene, Debbie, Milton year, but we were looking at over $100 billion in damages from one storm alone, right? This isn't a sustainable cadence of these very extreme storms. And there is data that really connects how increased heat and increased temperatures in the Gulf are making these storms intensify faster. And that's specifically a problem for those of us on the west side of the state, but it affects the whole state. So we really dug in here and said, well, what are the numbers? Because you don't have every community affected differently. If we flip over to out of storms and floods into heat, one of the interesting things about that one is you see a lot of risk on the west side of Florida and much less in the Panhandle and the Northeast, right? And so are we thinking about what more frequent and more dramatic fires would look like, right? It is a thing that Florida talks about a lot less, but it is a climate-related risk.
Why would there be more heat on the west coast of Florida than the east?
I can't answer the why.
It's just a fact.
It's the way that they're looking at projected changes in rainfall patterns and things like that. But I'm not pretending to be a science that's outside my skill set. But we really wanted folks to sort of go, oh, okay, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for, workers in the construction industry, right? There's been a lot of conversations about do we need to have some protections in place because they're now really suffering the consequences of, if you're in Collier County and you're roofing and it's 126 degrees out, that's a real threat. And those are the types of things that we need to start thinking about ahead of the highest and most dangerous risks. And then we can go back to energy and security. And just to get back to your question, we really wanted to dig in. And this one surprised me when we looked at energy cost burden. So as heat rises, I will be running my air conditioning a little bit more than I am today, right? As probably you will and everybody else. And that comes with cost, obviously. What I didn't anticipate until this research was done was how dramatic that impact is inland. So in our rural communities, there's a much higher energy cost burden. And when you look at it like this, you really start to understand that this isn't a political conversation, right? That everybody in our state is being impacted, although in different ways. And so it's really trying to sort of help folks understand that and then get to some solutions to ameliorate the pain.
The idea about, and I really appreciate the idea where, it's not necessarily, hey, are the polar ice caps melting? How's this going to affect the polar bears? I like how it's dialed into specific things that are almost inherent facts about living in Florida, right? We've always had hurricanes. It's always been hot in the summer, right? We've always had these massive rainstorms that come through every afternoon in the summertime. We had some historic ones this year. You mentioned flooding outside of the coastal areas. I spoke to the emergency managers over at Hillsborough County. That they said that was about a 1 in 300 year event. They've never recorded the Hillsborough River that high. Because of that, it flooded neighborhoods that have never flooded in their entire history. So when something like that happens, it's such a better effort for us to focus on, okay, that happened, that's a fact. How do we mitigate it in the future? The idea that, oh, that's a historic event, it'll never happen again, is so short-sighted. We can plan for these things. You can't stop them. And I hope today we could talk about how we can't stop this. You can certainly mitigate it, but you can't make it cooler. You can't reduce the number of storms a year. We can absolutely build a community that is resilient to these things. So I love how it's focused on Florida. So these are your three main points that the Environmental Defense Fund is focused on, right? Can you tell me in the last year with these recent storms, because on the slide where you have the storm damage, you don't even have listed the major ones this year, right? You haven't updated that yet. Those are way far beyond the storms of the past. Mm-hmm. Has the last few months over the summer shifted your efforts in any one area? Like, I would imagine the storm thing is red flag everywhere for you guys, because if something like that were to happen again back to back sooner rather than later, it'll totally kill us.
Yeah, I don't think it's changed the path forward for us. We are hoping it has sort of put some folks in a position of understanding that we've got to move faster than we thought we were moving. There's this sort of very outdated concept of, oh, this was a 1 in 300 year event or a 1 in 500 year event. Well, Hurricane Ian was a 1 in 500 year event, and Helene was a 1 in 300 year event, and they happened within 2 years.
Right.
Like, we need to stop thinking about those types of odds, because that's based on historical data, which is no longer what's applying here, right? So we have to be really clear-eyed around that. I think we know, and we just recently produced a report on some insurance reforms with Senator Brandis and his team at the Florida Policy Project that really looked at how you connect the insurance issue, right? And what we need to do. And while there are some little policy tweaks that can be made, fundamentally, if we do not reduce risk, we cannot reduce insurance, right? Like, that's just the math of it. And so thinking through, how do we get a handle on what we have, what we learned in Hurricane Ian? We saw areas with significant mangroves had such a meaningful role in protecting the communities behind them, who maybe didn't like the mangroves because it didn't give them the view that they wanted previously. But now it literally saved their homes that they were behind mangroves. How do we take that learning and do a statewide audit of our nature-based infrastructure that we already have, that we don't have to build, and make sure that we do some protection of that, and then figure out where we need to build in some more of that? Because you don't want a seawall looking out at Tampa Bay, a 20-foot concrete structure in the middle of Tampa Bay, right? Nobody does. But we need protection. And how do we do it in a way that allows Florida to still look and feel like Florida, but provides meaningful and cost-effective protection?
On my drive to the studio this morning, I was coming up Bayshore, and I thought, it would make a lot of sense from a storm surge perspective, from a resiliency perspective, and environmental perspective, to do a mangrove all along Bayshore Boulevard and have that area be essentially protected from the surge that happens from hurricanes, from large rainstorms. Not even really hurricanes can breach water over that wall. And then I thought, boy, that would really ruin the view, right? So it kind of brought this thought of balance in my head, where it's like, how far can you push resiliency to where it doesn't disrupt what we all enjoy? If you're going to put up a huge wall around Tampa to protect from any waves, and then you put up a big glass roof for all the rain, like, what are we left with, right? We're just left with this concrete box that we all live in. Like, I don't think anyone wants that. So there is a conversation of, how do you marry those two things? Mm-hmm. Knowledge has been one of the most interesting parts of growing up in Florida, learning about these storms, how they affect us. Mangroves, right? Mangroves help break up that wave action and dramatically increase the chances of damage mitigation inside of the coast. I mean, that's something that I've observed. When you're a little kid, you do these field trips at the aquarium or other places, they show you in little mini scale models how mangroves naturally protect the coastline. Nature has a fantastic way of doing what maybe humans should do, learn from that, right? And then also too, I thought it was very interesting to learn about, depending on where the storm hits, it'll suck water out of Tampa Bay or push water in Tampa Bay. Mm-hmm. It's not something you necessarily thought of in decades past, But now with the all just the different radar systems, the technology we have today, the live cams, and then being there in person, watching it happen. I think it was a year ago or 2 years ago, we had a storm that was only two storms that were only maybe 5-6 weeks apart. One of them hit north of the bay, one of them hit south. One sucked water out, one pushed water up. And so for this storm season, everyone was waiting on that answer. Where is the storm going to hit? Is it going to hit north and push water into the bay, or is it going to hit south? That was interesting too. I think as we move forward, all these different things we learn, these are tools to use. If the water's being sucked out, we can figure out a way to maybe, I don't know, mitigate that. But if the water's being pushed in, that's where that mangrove conversation comes in, right? So specifically, what has the EDF done, let's say in the last few years, or even in its history? Tell me some initiatives that you've worked on and pushed forward that you're proud of. You did mention the flood disclosure, and that's a fantastic thing. That's law now, is that a seller has to disclose if the home was flooded.
Yep.
Which is beyond water intrusion, just to be clear, right? Because water intrusion was always law, was it not? Where if you had some sort of a leak in your plumbing, right, you had to disclose that, as far as I know.
I'd have to check on that one. I know there was voluntary disclosure, but I don't think that one was mandatory.
There was always the lawyer, when you would ask an attorney, it's like, well, water intrusion and water rise and flooding, there's like a legal definition of flooding, right? If you go to the insurance company and you have a pipe break versus a hurricane storm surge, there's different policies that come into effect.
Yeah. And it's a really important distinction, as not to keep sort of moving back to insurance, but like that is a hard lesson a lot of people learned this year. Oh my God, my homeowner's insurance doesn't cover flooding. And that's the type of thing we need to expand awareness on, because people can't, have their entire life savings wrapped up in their house and risk losing it because they, didn't read the fine print in the 700-page insurance disclosure they signed during their mortgage closing, right? Like that's a real challenge. So we want to make sure that
terms and conditions.
Yeah,
right?
we're bringing in kind of that base level knowledge. One of the things that was really important to us was when the governor established the Office of Resilience, was that we help build up a structure so that communities can go ahead and find the resources they need to be able to do some of these projects that will keep their residents out of harm's way. So some of them are stormwater projects, others are, specific to a particular flooding area, but we need to build out a comprehensive plan the way that the Department of Transportation knows what they're doing for the next 5 years. These are the major projects. This is what we've got to do. We are now building that with the flood hub at USF, and with the legislature doing regular, and meaningful funding for resilience programming. That's absolutely necessary. We want to make sure that we're doing that marriage, though, of green infrastructure and gray, because that's your best ROI. So that's one area. Like I said, we did a lot on helping get school buses funded. There was a lot of federal dollars available. And we know that the air quality inside the bus, and I'm a mom, so I'm thinking about my kids when I'm looking at it, it's damaging. But it is also more cost effective for school districts to have these electric buses. They have lower operating costs. They obviously have no fuel costs over time. And now you're saving taxpayers money, and we can pay teachers what they deserve instead of wasting it on diesel fuel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's win-wins there. And so we were making sure that communities really understood the opportunity and get some of that down. And one of the big areas for us has been focusing on energy efficiency. So Florida is actually one of the lagging states in terms of having the utilities required to meet certain demand side management energy efficiency goals. Meaning, how do I help particularly my more low income communities who are living in rentals, older rentals that may not be well taken care of and don't have the ability to put in storm windows or add insulation, right? And they're making less money, and they've got these high electric bills because they're running their air conditioner, right? So it's trying to figure out how we can create less waste by finding these energy efficiency solutions, because that's a win-win, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're producing the energy, the last thing we should do is is arranged. And there are just some policy barriers we've got to move out of the way. It is right now a one-size-fits-all approach on energy efficiency. There are some voluntary programs that the utilities do. Some are better than others, but most are still not available unless you own your home and you can actually make the change. You have the authority to make the changes in that home. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily serving the most needed population that needs help kind of making sure that their power stays on.
On the energy conversation, that one is very alarming. You get that power bill in mid-July, $450. I paid at my small rental, it was about 2,000 square feet. It's a decent sized house, I guess, medium size, whatever. It's like $450, $500, little old house with a brand new air conditioner. Now, because it was an old home, it didn't have adequate insulation. It had older windows. It had gaps in the door. And I'm a tenant, right? I don't own the home. I'm not going to spend money on resiliency for this rental, right? That's not my obligation. So that's a bridge to gap. And I think education is an important fact to that in terms of when to keep your air on, when to keep it off, maybe what temperature would be recommended. The problem is it's so dang hot, you just want to crank that thing 24/7. And it's a tough ask of people to say, hey, don't use the air conditioner at X time. How do you say that to a family here in Florida?
And it's more than just comfort,
Yeah.
right? Like we have actual mold concerns. We have actual health concerns at certain, levels. What's interesting is Florida affordable housing does not require air conditioning. Up in New York, you can't have a unit to rent without having heat in it.
I think heat is actually required in Florida.
Yeah, but air conditioning is not.
But that goes back to what you said about blanket approaches.
Right.
That's a washed out blanket approach from old times that does not take into account today's world. To not have a landlord require air conditioning in Florida seems completely backwards.
Yeah.
Do you know the reason for that? Is that a historic thing? Why would that be the case?
I don't know the history. I think it's a thing that we need to sort of take a solid look at. And look, I also understand that the utilities make money selling energy, right? So why would they be in the business of creating a scenario where customers are paying less and using less energy? And the answer is we have to get the incentives right. We need to be looking at like how a utility gets paid for performance versus kilowatt hours, because that design incentivizes waste, right? And that's not a win for anybody because we're all sharing the cost of the fuel that we're importing. Like we have we don't have an unlimited supply of energy production. So we have to be really thoughtful. And I think that's a challenge we're going to see really, really escalating in the next few years.
Well, energy utility is interesting, right? They're a business and they're in the business of making a profit. And you're right. How could a utility company say, hey, turn the tap off. Hey, turn your air conditioner off. We want to make less money. It's hard to put them in that position. I do know someone from TECO talked to me about a program they have where they will actually come to your home and help you get your home in a place where it's more efficient. They'll tell you, hey, if you could seal up that gap in the window frame, hey, if you could add insulation, hey, XYZ. They've said they will help you figure that out. How that unfolds itself with millions of customers is maybe a different story. There's gaps there. What about the actual energy itself? Okay, so here in Tampa, we have a waste to energy plant. We burn our garbage, we create energy. I believe the silly city sells it to energy companies, right? And the city makes a little money on that. I think that's genius, right? Burn the garbage if you can figure out a way to mitigate that smoke, have it not poison the air, and you're creating energy and not building up a landfill. Sounds like a win. Nuclear power is kind of coming into the conversation. All other alternative forms of energy. We have a lot of sunshine here. Maybe solar is our answer. How big of a mountain is it to climb to switch that Big Bend power plant, which powers our city, from coal, I believe it's coal, I think it's coal or some sort of a fossil fuel, to a nuclear power or to a massive solar farm? Like, has the Environmental Defense Fund looked at getting out of fossil fuels and into these more renewable sources of energy in Florida?
Yeah, Of course we have. And I think first is to sort of have the economic conversation. It did not used to be true that renewable energy was less expensive than fossil fuel. It is today. It is 15% cheaper for a utility to build a new solar generating facility than it is for them to build a natural gas one. And they will never have to be importing natural gas to service it, right? So on a base economic situation, if you sort of took everything else away, utilities should be, moving very quickly to adopt, and most of them are, as much solar as possible. The second thing, I assume you've got, a little pot of retirement money somewhere that you and your family sort of puts away for rainy day. And I would ask you if you would put 75% of it in a single stock, because that's what hedge we have going on in energy production in Florida. We have 75% of our energy security in natural gas, which is piped in from out of state. We're not producing this. This isn't, and so anything happens. It could be, something disrupts the gas pipeline. A handful of years ago, there was an issue that they had a pipeline disruption, and all of a sudden there was a sheer panic, right? Straight from an energy security standpoint, like, we need to diversify our portfolio. We have to have multiple ways of keeping the lights on. And that's just pragmatic. We also saw last summer, the conflicts in Ukraine. Like, natural gas is a worldwide commodity. It's a very volatile market. And everybody's electric bill in Florida went through the roof because those natural gas prices skyrocketed, right? And so we're vulnerable to all of these things that are outside our control unless we kind of rein it in and put in more solar, more options so that we can hedge. There's also this interesting fact that in high winds, so in a hurricane, your gas plants have to come offline first. They're the most vulnerable to high wind. There's this great image of I believe it was a Duke solar facility that a tornado ran right through during Hurricane Milton. And what was amazing to me wasn't that the tornado did damage to a couple of the panels, because of course it did, but the rest of the facility was still generating energy. That would not have happened
Right.
in a traditional power plant setting, right? And so, some people are like, oh my God, see, the solar panels got hurt. And I'm like, yeah, but that's the wrong story. Like, they're still kicking.
Right.
They're still producing.
I think the problem with the solar panels is the space, right? You're talking about a lot of land and horizontal space required to put solar panels in. So while it might not be the whole solution, it's a part of the solution. I know FGCU has a huge solar field, massive solar field. They power a lot of that school with, which is phenomenal. It's a private entity. I guess they're a public school, right? Florida Gulf Coast University. But still, it's this organization that's taken it upon themselves to have their own power system through solar on their own real estate. Kind of interesting. Whether you can get Big Ben to bulldoze that thing and do a solar field, I don't know. And I don't even know that space would be adequate enough if that entire property was solar. I don't know, but I would doubt that it produces the same energy as that natural gas or coal plant or whatever it is there now. Doesn't solar require a large amount of horizontal space? So in some applications, it doesn't quite make sense on large scale. But as an example, this building, right, if the entire roof was a solar panel, maybe that's adequate for us.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of opportunity with distributed storage. So, like, look at your universities, look at your prisons. Your Department of Corrections energy bill is, like, fascinating.
Right.
And that's taxpayer dollars, right? That's all taxpayer funded. And yet, if we had solar on those roofs, we would see the costs coming down significantly because you can just use that on site. It used to be true that, and it is a concern, we have to have base load, right? And so solar, what happens when the sun's not there, right? We are now in a moment where the world has changed and the batteries are economically viable, the solar panels are economically viable. And you see, like, Florida Power and Light is only doing solar and storage in their 10-year plan, right? Like, that's the only thing on the table because they're responding to the economics to deliver for their shareholders, right? Their why might be different than my why, right? But we were both getting to the exact same solution.
That's always been the biggest question is, well, the batteries are not adequate to hold the power necessary, or the solar panels don't produce enough. But you're saying now, economically, from a cost perspective, we're there. The technology is there.
Technology is there. And we're finding like really wild stories. So in the last 2 hurricanes, we gathered up a handful of stories from folks that were like, a veterinarian was operating because she was running power through her electric vehicle to be able to treat animals immediately following the storm. We had, people here in Tampa Bay waiting in incredible lines for gasoline. Who wasn't doing that? The EV owners.
Right.
Right. We saw a lot of these benefits where you created this, closed loop system. And now if I'm keeping my refrigerator going and my food's not spoiling, even though I don't have power for a couple of days, you're really easing the pressure. And so there are ways that we can have some distributed solar. I've got solar on my roof, and then that lowers the demand on what always needs to be produced from your base load capacity at a place like Big Bend.
When you put solar on your roof, is there is there a reason why the power company would disincentivize you to do that? Sounds like they would be making less money off you, right? So do they have some sort of a deal? Because I don't have solar on my roof, so I don't know. Do they have something where you still have to pay a certain amount of utility?
Yep, there's a minimum bill. For Duke, it's $35 a month.
And that's basically, hey, just to be connected, you owe us this fee.
Yeah, so you're getting the benefit of being on the grid, right? And I think that's fair, right? Like that's a legitimate thing. Right now, Florida actually has one of the better laws for homeowners solar or individual business solar, because every kilowatt hour that I put on the grid from the solar on my house, I'm getting paid the same amount as I pay Duke for whatever I pull from the grid, right? So 1 to 1. So it's fair. And then I also make sure I pay this $35 a month minimum bill. So I'm also helping support the statewide infrastructure and the grid because I'm connected to it, and that's important. That has come up as a legislative remedy. A bill a few years ago proposed that be changed and that people get paid, a quarter or a third of the amount that they pay their utility per kilowatt hour. So I pay you $3, you pay me $1 kind of situation. And there was a lot of pushback on that because people are trying to find ways to preserve their affordability. I would say, right now there's a really good, that in order to get back your money from the investment of putting solar on your roof, right now there are federal opportunities that will make that more affordable. And then this process of getting, fair payment for the energy you produce is also there. And so we want to make sure that people can put some safeguards in place to kind of, mitigate what their electric bill is going to look like. It is going to go up. That's a fact.
These storms exposed a lot of weaknesses in our resiliency and our also reliance on different aspects of our economy. One of them was we had on the vice president of the Port of Tampa Bay, Raul Alfonso, right? And he was talking about how 40 to 50% of the entire state's fuel comes from Port Tampa Bay. And so when that storm took that port offline for 12 hours, 24 hours, however long it was, like you said, it totally disrupted the flow of fuel. So that's gasoline, that's diesel, that's people's generators, that's keeping the power on, that's your car, everything. And I thought, that sounds like a dangerous statistic to have all your eggs in one basket. Whatever that solution may be to spread that more thin, or this whole conversation about more solar, et cetera, would help with that. But another point of resiliency that got brought up during these storms was our resiliency to the federal government. You just talked about how solar panels, you have incentives to the federal government, and what makes it economical for a customer right now to get solar is not the incentives by the city of Tampa or by Hillsborough County or the state of Florida. It's the federal government. What is it? 10, 15,000 probably. You probably get a nice chunk back, right?
It's a percentage.
Yeah. But it's probably healthy enough to where a consumer can feel like, damn, this is a good deal through that federal incentive.
Sure.
So my point is Florida's resiliency to the federal government. What if that tap gets shut off at the federal level? We have a new administration coming in who's made a huge point about eliminating different federal agencies, federal workers, whatever. And whatever way that shakes out, it'll shake out. But you got to think that some of those incentives will be wiped off the table. And so how does the state of Florida stay insulated enough to where the federal government could get rid of a program like that? Cool, we're still good. Florida, from a policy perspective, from different incentives, local, state level, have figured out a way to make up for it. I feel like something that could occur in the next 2-5 years through the next administration is, hey, Florida can't so much rely on the feds anymore for grant money, solar, whatever it may be. Has that came up in the last few months? That has to be something on the radar that you guys are trying to figure out, is how does Florida stay in its own bucket as much as we can? We can't do it alone. Sure. Some of these things cost. I mean, the numbers on these projects are incredible, and the state can't afford it on their own. There has to be a federal relationship, but how much is the question?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of layers there. So one is understanding that what these incentives have done over the last handful of years is lower the cost, right? So you increase demand, you lower the cost, you now have affordable solar panels. So even if you took the subsidies away, especially with the growing price of electricity, there's a lot more parity there than there would have been otherwise, right? So that's setting that piece. The second is we're having a lot of conversations about energy dominance and our role as a country and what that needs to look like. Well, if we're manufacturing solar panels in our country, in our state, then we are in a lot more control of, what the costs look like and how we are playing a more global role in securing our own energy future, right? And so I think there's like a lot of pieces to unpack. Grant funding is really only ever intended to be a catalyst. And that's what we're seeing that those investments have worked. They're driving down prices. And if you look at the sheer number of solar installing companies here in the state of Florida, right? Those are jobs that are keeping people employed. Lots of actually veterans have opened up solar installation companies. And so you start to sort of build this circular economy
an entire
that
new
we
industry
can sustain. Absolutely.
Yeah. Where are the solar panels made now, generally? I mean, is it overseas or is it in America?
There are more new manufacturing in America, like getting off the ground in the last couple of years. But yeah, it was traditionally dominant from China. And so then we had some federal policies around that because there was some concerns about that.
Resiliency on every level, right? Like COVID exposed the whole manufacturing weakness of the country, which was, what happens if there's an event that shuts off that supply from overseas for our goods and our services? If we're reliant on China to produce every solar panel, well, what if A, they decide to increase the price, B, they decide to not sell them anymore, their plant catches on fire, COVID, you name it, right? Resiliency on every level is important. From every level too, from a local perspective, state perspective, federal perspective. So yeah, I would imagine that there's money that is going to be fought for in a more dramatic way in terms of these grants and these federal incentives. But it's interesting what you just said about how the market has almost played itself out to a point where the industry itself is resilient because of all these different jobs it's provided, the workers, the demand from the consumer, right? All of these sort of things have grown into this like castle, so to speak, where the industry itself is resilient because of how big it's gotten, which is great news. Yep. Something that could screw that up, though, is that bill or law, maybe it's already been passed, that says the energy company is only going to pay you $1, right? Or a third or a quarter or whatever that you're paying for energy versus solar. So that's a dangerous thing that could happen. Now, I would imagine the public would say, hey, that's not fair at all. But you probably have large interest groups on the utility side that are trying to fight for a better position for themselves.
Yep. And that bill played out a couple of years ago, and it passed, and it was vetoed by Governor DeSantis.
Ooh.
So, this has been a active public dialogue. It's also why I tell people if you're going to get solar, get it in now while you're still grandfathered in at that older policy rate, because I fully expect we'll see it again. And it's up to folks in Florida to sort of decide whether they should be able to produce their own energy, or if they have no choice but to buy from the regulated monopoly utilities, right? Like,
Right.
and what does parity look like?
But the problem is the consumer doesn't really get a choice. We get to pick the governor, and thank God he vetoed it. And we get to pick the representatives that put that bill up and push that bill through. But we, the people, don't get to vote on that specific policy.
Right.
And I think that's where the disconnect, that's where it gets a little weird. So how do you know whoever you're voting for on the ticket is going to follow through? And is this conversation even happening during that election? Maybe that specific conversation about that energy policy never came up because everyone's distracted about social issues or hurricanes or whatever it may be. You might not even get a seat at the table at all in that conversation. I mean, this is the first time I'm hearing about this from you, right? Like, I didn't even know this was occurring. I didn't even know it passed.
It did. Well, it did.
No, but I mean,
yeah.
it passed in the legislature,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
So how close was that to becoming a law? Sounds like it was very close.
It was very close.
And DeSantis stopped it.
And the fact that you're hearing it from me means I'm doing my job, right? Because that's what advocates in the policy landscape do. I don't expect families who are busy, putting dinner on the table for their kids, getting through their day, working 2 jobs, to be watchdogging what's happening on the 350 bills that are going to be filed this legislative session, which ones might actually move and what those things mean to them. That is the role that Environmental Defense Fund tries to play, is making sure that we're asking the hard questions, we're helping showcase what the opportunities are or the risks with particular pieces of policy, so that we can get to solutions that are really helpful to Florida families. Like, that's the goal. And so I would say for folks that want to kind of be plugged in, is maybe it doesn't have to be EDF, but find that organization that is going to be doing that work. Support them, read their newsletter, because I get it. Like, we're in the age of information overload.
Yeah.
And it happens to me at home. My husband wants to talk about environmental things that happened at the end of the day, and I'm like, I don't want to do that. It's after 5 o'clock. Like,
American Idol's on.
Yeah, we all just kind of want to shut it off.
Right.
But we are also in a defining moment, and particularly for our state, particularly given the economic risks that we are facing from climate, that shutting it off isn't an option.
The good news is we know we are here. We know we have an incredible amount of people moving here. Every statistic, demographic study, migration pattern shows we're going to grow for the next few decades. So the good news is, hey, we know this is coming. We know we're going to have a lot more people. We pretty damn well know the challenges our state is facing. How do we get there? Education and knowledge, and not being ignorant on these subjects. And I don't mean ignorant because you're not paying attention. I mean ignorant because, like we're saying, you shouldn't have to sit here all day and pay attention. That's what elected officials are for. That's what you're here for, right? That's what maybe this show could be here for. The power of the public, right? If the public doesn't know that there's an issue happening, we can't stop it from happening, right? That public policy that got pushed through, right, regarding the power that DeSantis vetoed, the public probably at large was not aware of that issue. Versus, look at the state park issue that came up, where the entire state stood up and said, hell no, you're not going to put golf courses on our parks and benches everywhere and rip up and do parking lots. Like, no, we don't want that. Boom. In a flash, it got eliminated. So my point was, the more the public has at least a basic level of understanding of what is happening, the more we can sway things one way or the other. That's the two perfect examples of why the public needs to be informed on these issues. Look how powerful we were as a state, as a people that didn't want people screwing with our state parks.
And look how unified.
I
mean, everyone, every party, every socioeconomic
you had some yahoos
status.
out there, I will say, because we posted about it.
We're Florida.
I know. You're going to have the crazies out there. We had some people talking about, like, don't you enjoy bathrooms at your state parks? And don't you? It's like, hey, that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a complete overstep of amenities at parks that should be protected for nature. We're not talking about a couple little parking spaces and a little bathroom. We're talking about golf courses. We're talking about accommodations.
In many cases, we were talking about parks that are barrier islands. We would have been literally talking about removing mangroves from barrier islands for hotels.
Yeah, not good. Now, when that popped up, what did the Environmental Defense Fund, first of all, what was the in-house reaction to news breaking? Because that was a whistleblower, right? That was an internal piece of information that got exposed.
Yep. Yeah. So we immediately did our outreach directly to the government agencies that were involved, as well as, so we sent a letter sort of outlining our concerns, our some recommendations for a public process that would allow Floridians to engage, because there were, you may remember, it was like 9 hearings that were all going to happen simultaneously and only in person at the various state parks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we asked for that to get shifted, and then we immediately did some blasts out to make sure that all of the folks in Florida that are members and supporters knew what was happening and gave them the opportunity to send information or share their concerns with their lawmakers. And you saw, I mean, within hours,
Right.
you saw key legislators saying, we are not on board here, and our public is not either. And so it's those rapid responses that sometimes you have to do, and sometimes you have more lead time, right? Like, we need to be, I don't want to be playing defense. I want to be finding the solutions and spending our time on that. And that's where, it can be a little harder in the advocacy game to get folks as animated about a future solution as respond to a crisis of the day, right? But we can't just run around with our hair on fire screaming Chicken Little. We need to do building blocks. And I think that the good news is Florida has started to take that seriously. So we have, $2 billion now invested over the last handful of years in resilience measures. We've got a long way to go and a lot of projects that aren't funded yet, but we're starting to take seriously some of those risks. And I think, again, we're doing that in a bipartisan way that doesn't happen other places.
The conversation about getting the public behind something when you are on the offensive. So, a good example is that park deal, right? Where probably no one's paying attention to it until the whistleblower came out. Or maybe an even better example is flooding in areas that really should never have flooded. They flooded because either the storm pumps failed, we had historic rainfall that backflowed up into the pumps, then the pumps weren't able to pump out the neighborhoods, etc. Before these storms, how do you get the public and the political will to say, hey, by the way, we need to spend $50 million on this pipe underground. It's going to tear up the roads for 6 months and it's going to cost an insane amount of money. And by the way, we're going to wrap it all up with asphalt and you're never going to see it. So it's not a sexy new park. It's not a new condo tower. It's not a new cute little cafe. It's a total unsexy infrastructure move for a lot of money that's going to be a pain in the ass. How do you sell that, right? Now, when there's a crisis, the conversation right now, the good news is everyone's talking about it, right? So it's easier to get stuff like that done. That must be your greatest challenge, is putting the information out there in a way where the public is behind pushing forward something like that without letting some of the noise of concerns muddy down the initiative that you're advancing, right? Can you talk about that? How is that achieved through the EDF?
Well, I think one of the things to recognize is that by and large, the public is already in support of these investments. We see that. We see them in local communities passing bond referendums to fund this work. It's just like a homeowner. You're like, I don't want to pay for my plumbing to be fixed, but also I got to pay for my plumbing to be fixed, right? And so you're seeing that the majority of Floridians are on board with those investments. Now, that said, have we had conversations where there was very literally a risk of losing billions of dollars in federal investment on storm surge because a certain community who will remain nameless didn't want to lose a few spots of beach parking? Yeah, that happens. There's short-term thinking. There are people that, can't quite see the forest through the trees and understand that this is about building out for a generation, right? Because this infrastructure is 50 years 50-year investments. And that's where, we need to be just explaining to folks, look, when they do these bond initiatives, for example, and a community has taken some real steps towards building out the resilience, one of the first things that happens is their insurance ratings get improved and their rates drop. So while they might not have gotten a new cafe, they got a more affordable homeowners insurance policy as a result.
I would imagine every carrier right now is looking at Florida and these local communities going, okay, let's see what you're going to do. Are you going to try to mitigate this stuff? Because if you're not, we're certainly not lowering insurance costs.
Right. And insurance, the way the market works is, so there's two things you have to know. One is I'm an insurance person. I'm writing your policy based on this year's risk. But this year's risk isn't the same as last year's risk. That's what climate has done, and whether or not you sort of subscribe to where the science is that climate is caused by human activity, there is consensus that the climate is changing, right? So we could just set that aside. We can't look at yesterday's risk models to write policies that effectively cover today's population, right? That doesn't work. We have to start looking long term and figuring out how to put those pieces in place so that as situations continue to deteriorate, we've built up the safety to sort of balance it out and keep us at a minimal, an affordable insurance coverage space. Because you're seeing a lot more families going what they call naked on insurance. And now they've got, a $400,000 home that's paid off that gets wiped out. Yeah. And they have no recourse, no financial, backing to kind of put it all back together. And it's scary.
I don't want to say, those are the people most affected, because there were certainly people in coastal areas that got hammered too. But there was a lot of people that were not in flood zones that either did not have a mortgage or had a mortgage, but flood was not required. Mm-hmm. And they figured, I don't need it. 1 in 500 years, I think, is an ex-flood zone. Yep. Could you pull up the flood map of, just type in FEMA flood map Tampa? So people don't understand, and more people should understand this. We live in Florida, and the way our elevation works is, in general, rain falls all over the state, but Central Florida is higher than the coast. Okay, now there's only variations of tens of feet, right? Sometimes a couple hundred feet. When rain fills that Hillsborough River, as it flows out into the bay, it fills up ponds, lakes, streams all along the way. When Florida was developed, a lot of those waterways were totally disrupted. And the way the government at the time, and I think it's relatively the same now, dealt with that development was they said, oh, you're going to remove this wetland. Okay, well, now you have to build a big pond that would capture the water that would otherwise go in the wetland in one place. Well, if the Hillsborough River is super high and all the lakes and the feeder ponds and the streams that go to the bay are super high too, and the bay itself has a surge, where do you think that retention water is going to go? It's going to overspill into that neighborhood. So if you zoom out, David, on the city of Tampa, now this is a FEMA flood map. So this really only shows the coastal areas of surge. Zoom into Parkland Estates. Do you know where that is, David? Okay, so bottom left, it's catty corner on the left section of where it's highlighted. So the Hyde Park area, kind of like where we're at right now. Yeah. Scroll down a little bit. So pause right here. Where all these trees are on the map, Parkland Estates, for those listening, it's kind of near the Palmacia Golf Course, right? That area is actually a basin, okay? But on the map, and I don't know why it's not updating, but on the map, it's an ex-flood zone. So a buyer would look at that and go, ex-flood zone, I'm good. But they don't understand that the topography of that area is actually lower than the surrounding. We're only talking a few feet, but a few feet make a massive difference. That area had water in it that sat there for hours and hours and hours and days because it wasn't able to be pumped out. There's a discrepancy between information here. People can no longer look at the FEMA map to determine their flood risk. You have to look at the topography. Now, what I believe is going to happen, and I've talked to a couple people at the city, they're going to be putting out some sort of a map that actually combines both of those things together, where you have the city of Tampa map, the topography, these different basins with these storm pumps, and the FEMA map, which shows the coastal area. So you can see the Hillsborough River, you can see the flood risk, but you don't see any risk in the interior section. And some of those interior sections flooded, not only Parkland Estates, but up north too. And around the Babe Zaharis Golf Course, right? Forest Hills flooded. That's an ex-flood zone. You saw areas in Sarasota, same thing. Out in Riverview, Gibsonton, right? All the way out east in Hillsborough County flooded. We haven't, and I say we, right? There hasn't been the correct information showed to the public. Too many realtors have just said ex-flood zone, you're good to go, and advised their clients that it was a purchase based on no flood risk. That wasn't true, and it's not the realtor's fault. It's really not anyone's fault. When you have a historic event, I think it's hard to find fault. I think you need to learn from it and grow and move forward. How do you plan for something historic if it's historic? You kind of can't, right? I think moving forward, there needs to be some federal initiative to show a more detailed plane of water flow. So not only coastal high hazard areas, which is essentially what this map is, but it should also show what did the map look like 100 years ago, right? Scroll down, David, to Bayshore Beautiful. Do you know where that is? Down the peninsula. So Gandy Boulevard. You see Gandy? Scroll in right there, Bayshore Boulevard. So where it says AE on the right, David, up here on the right. Yeah. A lot of people don't know that used to be a lake. Now you can see it here on the FEMA map, how it peels out into the peninsula. But that area, when you stand in that area, you are lower than all sides, meaning if you have a storm surge event, even though if your house is built up a little bit, you're going to get water. You're living in a lake. That information isn't material fact. It's not required by the realtor, the seller. Now, if you've had flooding before, you have to disclose that. But there's no information out there about the history of wetlands, waterways, streams, where the old rivers were. I think that needs to be expressed. Is that something you guys have seen? Because this is a massive piece of news that I don't think anyone was thinking about before. Water in non-ex-flood zones.
So a few years ago, they created the Flood Hub, which is based out of USF. And the idea was we would get all of Florida's best and brightest scientists and geographers and all of those and create our own set of maps. So we're not relying on federal maps, and we'll have much more granular data points, right? And that was the idea. And my understanding is that work was completed back in the spring, but those maps have yet to be publicly released. So we're getting there.
Is that something we could Google? Is that ready to be looked at all?
It has not been
publicly
released yet.
That's exciting, and I think it also, again, the conversation about having resiliency from the federal government and I mean that in a positive way, right? Where the federal government can't look at the whole country and know all these little streams and rivers and wetlands. That's a much bigger task than, say, the state of Florida guaranteeing that for the people that own real property here and live here and rent here. This is something that is at the top of every home buyer's mind and every tenant's mind. We're getting calls all the time now. We want to get off the island. We want to get off the coast. We want to be in an ex-flood zone. People are very flood conscious, very coastal conscious right now. There's tons of homes in certain select neighborhoods that flooded. You have a massive amount of inventory. End buyers don't want to take the risk at buying it. Builders, that's a healthy environment for a builder, and we should incentivize more new construction, raise those properties up out of the floodplain. There's things we can do on the local level in that regard too, and I wanted to talk to you about this. Has the EDF looked at any state or local policy that would dramatically incentivize a homeowner in these low-lying areas to tear down their house and build new?
How do you dramatically incentivize without outright paying for, the pretty prohibitive costs of doing that, right?
It's
Even
very
without
expensive.
tearing down your house, even if you're just going to elevate it, you're looking at several $100,000.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know a lot of people sitting on that liquid cash to do it, right? And so could we develop a program like a no interest loan program to allow folks to buy them? Sometimes they can't come, cash out of pocket with that. They can't figure out how to finance it. is there a vehicle that we could do? Because at the end of the day, the government is already losing money from these repetitive flood properties and the communities, right? And it is going to drive down real estate values. So there's a long-term play here. But while we're doing that, we can't also be putting new development in harm's way. Like we have to, we sort of have to figure out when it's not appropriate to move something in. And, look, we've all had friends that are like, oh, my house is elevated, so I'm going to ride out the storm. You're like, right, you're elevated. That means you're going to be isolated.
Yeah.
Like you can't come, you can't go, like you're stuck in your house. Are you sure that that's the thing you want to do in these circumstances? And so we need to be thinking a little bit, how do we help individual homeowners, but also how do we look at a community scale, what makes the most sense?
Yeah. And maybe we even disagree on that and we can talk about it, but I do think we should try to dramatically incentivize people to build new in those low-lying areas, because if those people were to move back in and build their house back, they're just going to get flooded out again. I know people in Sunset Park that have been flooded out like 3 or 4 times in the same house. And by incentive, I have a few different ideas. First of all, we have pots of money for affordable housing. We could certainly create a pot of money with low interest loans, 50, 75, 25,000, that would help for some sort of a down payment towards new construction. Property taxes, I know there's certain incentives, but we could extend incentives and say, hey, look, if you build new construction, we're not going to assess you for 3.5 years, right? We're not going to assess you on a $3 million home. It's going to be set at your old rate for 3 years, and then we'll reassess you, right? Express building permits. If you are in a flood zone, you want to build new to code, hurricane doors and windows, and you build it above the floodplain, there's an express line you get to get in for that building permit at a reduced cost, right? So these are all small different things that add up. I think we should incentivize development. And by the way, by development, I strictly mean tearing down what exists and replacing it with a structure that is to current hurricane and flood standard codes.
Sure.
I certainly don't mean increasing densification in flood zones. I don't believe in that, right? So just to be clear about what I mean by development, I essentially mean redevelopment. So I think we do need to get a lot of the homes that are in low-lying areas that were built in the 60s and 70s and even earlier. I mean, there's so many people in my neighborhood that have lived there since the 70s. They don't have a mortgage, so they don't have flood insurance. They get flooded out. Now they're sitting here with this house. The cheapest thing for them to do, you're right, elevating a home is hundreds of thousands of dollars. New construction's more than that. And so they're left with the option of, I'll just build it back. I'll spend 25, 50 grand having ServPro come out, drying the place out, put new floors and new cabinets in, paint it, and call it a day. It's like, that's the never-ending cycle I would like to see our community get out of, because this is going to happen again. That there's going to be another storm that floods these areas in our lifetime.
And I'm sure you're familiar with like the 50% rule, right? And so right now, if the value of the damage is 50% of the value of their home, they have to bring it up to code, right? And that's to stop just this phenomenon that you're talking about. But I'm 100% in agreement with you. Like, what are the suite of policy options we could create? And I think, taxation on improvements that prevent flooding is something that, that would appeal to most, right? Like, yeah, okay, so I made this investment and now my home is worth more. Should I be punished for safeguarding it from flooding? That's different than I added 4 new units and now it's a rental property. Maybe that should be taxed, right?
I was going to say thousands. How about thousands of new units, stick frame on Rattlesnake Point, right where it says, right there on that point south of Gandy Boulevard. That was probably a bad idea. So we're both on the same page. I think we both would agree that new development, increasing density in these areas is probably a bad move and probably very short-sighted.
And we're seeing zoning approvals for increased development density in Sanibel in areas that were wiped out in Hurricane Ian. And it is really difficult to sort of wrap your head around putting more folks in harm's way. Rebuild, upgrade, absolutely. But to increase density in places where we know are super vulnerable is terrifying.
It is terrifying. because it's an evacuation question. It's a question of what if people are stuck, like you said, if you're on your own island and you have a medical emergency and the police and the fire can't get to you. Evacuations is another thing. In my neighborhood, the first storm was Helene, right? Well, I guess even before that, it was Debbie this year. It was the bad one. But during Helene, no one evacuated. I'm in AE, I'm in Zone A evacuation for Hillsborough County. We got evacuated. I didn't evacuate. None of my neighbors did. But when that water started to rise, my neighbors that have been there for a long, long time started to get nervous. They had never seen water in that neighborhood before. I just moved in this summer, but they were getting nervous. Yeah. And there was a fire a block south of us. And fire trucks came and had to turn around. They had other calls to go to. They could not get to that home. So you're right. If you build in all these areas and you're above the floodplain, great. But what happens if you call the police and they can't get to you? It doesn't solve the issue. The issue is solved when people aren't living in areas they're not supposed to. When people are living in coastal areas, we're always going to have this conversation. When we put more density in areas where this conversation isn't on the table, I think that's a good thing when you're talking about 10, 20, 30. Florida's future, right? Our children, our grandchildren. In that context, it makes complete sense to drive the development out of these coastal areas. It's a hard conversation to have for people in Florida because we love living on the water.
Yep.
And there is a balance there.
It's true. But in 1985, Florida's statewide growth management planning process was best in the country. We had really thoughtful regional ways to look at how Florida should grow. And what has happened since that was dissolved under Governor Scott is each city or municipality or maybe even county just sort of development popcorns up instead of having any sort of comprehensive plan that gets reviewed, right? There's still some comprehensive plans, but they no longer go to the Department of Community Affairs for sort of a comprehensive look as like, does this make sense? And we lost that. And we now need that kind of like deep thinking about what really makes sense in the long game. Because otherwise you just get these things all happening piecemeal.
Right. So is the EDF working on some sort of larger, big picture, long run proposal and piecing in all these different factors you've included, the energies, the heat index, the coastal issues with the hurricanes, where we source our power from, like this comprehensive plan?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's one big policy. I think there's a suite of policy tools that can get us closer to where we need to be.
Yeah.
And so we are, trying to give folks some opportunities to kind of figure out what those should look like. I'm not suggesting we have all the answers, but I think there are some spaces where we can make some incremental progress and some meaningful education, right? It was very much almost everyone I talked to, and we were volunteering, mucking out some houses not far from us in St. Petersburg that flooded out. And everyone I spoke to went, but we've never flooded before. I mean, one family was like, oh yeah, we had our 2 cars here. And then my brother came and he had his car here. We lost all the cars. And I'm, like devastated for them, but they were relying on that historic knowledge and we can't do that anymore. And so how do we get policies that are forward-looking, a legislature that is forward-looking on like, okay, we're going to be clear-eyed about this problem and we're going to get ahead of it, even though we might not see the benefits of this rule in my short term of office, right? That is actually one of the challenges of having, elections every 2 years and term limits is people want to see a lot of short-term wins during their time, and these are not always easy short-term win kind of investments. We know that after Hurricane Andrew, Florida had the best wind rules in the country, if not the world, right? Like we were really best in class. And then slowly some of those pieces started eroding from building codes, right? Well, then that becomes a problem the next time another Cat 5 hits. So we have to be sort of willing to learn our lessons and then stay the course. So we're not looking at houses that, look, we're going to have houses like mine that's 105 years old that is, going to be vulnerable to a Category 5 wind. but we shouldn't be building anything new that isn't. I mean, that at this point would just be irresponsible.
How did you guys do in your home? That's an older home.
It is.
Like a bungalow style?
No, it's a 2-story wood frame. But because I work on climate change, when we were in the market for a home, I went elevation first.
St. Pete's got some high points too.
And that's where I live. So
Aren't you thankful you did that?
we were very fortunate. We did not flood in either event, lost a fence, which was, easily replaceable. Still chatting with the neighbors about their 40-foot mangrove that's looming precariously over our driveway at a 45-degree angle. But we were really fortunate.
Wow.
But we left. I mean, we took our kids and got out of Dodge for Milton because that was not a scenario that, we wanted to put them through and the stress through and knowing what Helene had just done to our community. And so we had, we left for that. We took our kids, we took our RV in case we needed to live in it when we came back. I mean, that was the kind of planning that we had to do. We actually were fortunate. We didn't have to throw out all of our food because the solar panels on our home kept the fridge going during the day in the week following when we didn't have power.
You've built your own resiliency in your homestead. I think that's really cool that you live in Florida. These issues affect you and your family in your home, and then you're working on the initiatives for the rest of the state. Yep. That's awesome. How cool is that? You see so much, and I don't want to really talk about the macro because it gets so far into the weeds with the polar bear conversation, right? When you go, you know what I mean? When you go that far out, and I know you have to sometimes battle those conversations in your work, but it is discouraging to see, they're talking about the polar bears flying around the world in a private jet, so insulated from their efforts, whereas you are dealing with it in your community, in your neighborhood, in your home. I mean, you're talking about keeping the fridge on when everyone else doesn't have power because you've made it a point to have a resilient home through solar energy. Like you're living your work. I think that's really sweet.
It's hard to not. I mean, when you're looking at the data all day long, it would be hard to sort of do something else.
Is that a pull with your family? Or do they challenge you when you say, hey, here's an idea. We're going to put some solar panels on this roof? No.
My husband's a scientist.
That helps.
So he's right on board. And so the kids are definitely immersed in climate change conversations and in risk. And even as young as they are. I mean, it was interesting.
How old are your kids?
5 and 8.
Do they recognize, I mean, historic storm is a hard thing to wrap your head around if you're 5 or 8 years old. From their perspective, this is their future that we're discussing, really. I mean, when you lay it on the table, it's not really us. I mean, I'm 32, I'm pretty young, but the initiatives that are pushed forward today in the infrastructure efforts and all this whole conversation, it's not really for us. It's the future of the state. It's for generations in the future. It's for the people that'll visit here in 100 years. So what do they think when they see a storm like that? And you explain to them, honey, this has never happened before.
Yeah. My 5-year-old's still fairly oblivious. But my 8-year-old is not. And for him, it's not his future. He is coming home telling me about his friends whose family lost their entire homes, right? He's like, hey, Mommy, why aren't we going camping this season? Well, because our RV is in a friend's house, and now they are living in it while they fix their flooded home, right? And so we go to Fort DeSoto. We camp there all the time. We love it. It's been closed since Helene, right? This is their lived experience. That's not something that, I think we understand as adults, that this is their normal and it's going to get worse. And so how do we put in some safeguards to make sure they can still call this place home?
What do you think immediately, things that you are looking at? You're looking at a lot of different things. What do you think immediately needs to happen? What's a critical point? I know it's all critical, but what's something that people should know listening to this?
I think we need to do a better job getting the information out there about risk. We really have to change the thinking from looking backward because we can't move forward with the investments unless we do that. So I think that's one. Once we do that, you're going to see the public support that's already there for funding resilience efforts go on the rise, right? And so let's get a statewide plan put together, published, Everybody sees what's on it. We know what needs to get done. And then we can make sound decisions, right? And I think that's essential. So we have, we kind of put these pieces in place. One of the other lessons from Hurricane Ian wasn't just about mangroves, but microgrids. We had an entire community in Southwest Florida that the lights did not go out because they had built in microgrids. Here at MacDill, they now have a microgrid so that they can function when the grid goes down. The military families don't have to be concerned about that piece. They can go and do the work that they need to do to protect the community, right? So what are those different tools? What are those opportunities? How do we take, a raised stadium rebuild as an opportunity to say, well, what if it was built to a Category 5 and had a microgrid and solar and now becomes a place where we can house linemen, we can have power to, to support people, whether they're medical evacuees or whatever it is, right? Let's build in, when we're making improvements, let's build them future ready. And yes, it's going to cost more on the front end, but it's a huge return on the back end.
Whose idea was it to house a bunch of linemen in a paper-roofed stadium when there was a huge hurricane coming? That just seems like a bad move. And then you look at the pictures and it's like totally destroyed. I don't know did they remove all those cots? It seems like we are early on enough in this timeline to make silly mistakes. But the good news in that is we are early enough to probably correct them and build resiliency along the way. Yeah, were those cots still in there? I think they were. No, they weren't. Oh, yeah, they were. Yep. So this thing was fully set up to house linemen, not accounting for this paper, whatever the hell material this is, roof that totally destroyed it. Thank God there was no one in there and no one got hurt. But you're so correct. Hey, look. There's a new plan moving forward. If it's a $2 billion plan, why not allocate a percentage of that budget for a more resilient stadium? Maybe you even build it in a way to provide shelter during hurricanes. Mm-hmm. Like literally maybe a part of its purpose is specifically for staging emergency operations, housing emergency workers. Like, let's be smart about the way we rebuild this community. If we build it back the same way in the context of the past and another storm comes through, here's a secret, it will. We know there's going to be more of these storms occurring. Why not build it off in a better way than before? And if it costs extra money, I said this on an episode with Bill Carlson, and I don't mean it, I'm being cheeky, but like, you got to kind of have a blank checkbook for your future. And if you don't pay for these things, they're going to get more complicated and more expensive over time. You think it's expensive now to build any infrastructure project. Good luck in 20 years. Look at 20 years ago when they wanted to do high-speed rail in Florida and the governor vetoed it. Think about now with the different right-of-ways and the real estate ownership and the easements and the cost. It's way more complicated and way more expensive now. It's a good investment to extend a little bit. And I don't think now's the time to be conservative on this stuff. I think now's the time to open up the checkbook and get the help we need to do this stuff so we don't have to deal with it in the future.
For a generation, folks have said, hey, maybe we should underground our power lines. And now we have a $2.9 billion cost from Duke for the hurricane recovery and response, right? And I'm not knocking Duke here. I'm just saying, like, what if we had made those investments when we thought they were expensive 2 decades ago?
Exactly.
What would our avoided cost look like after Ian and Helene and Milton, right? Like, all of a sudden, the math is different. Mm-hmm. But it was we're going to make the investment that seems affordable and hope that's not a future we face. We can't do that anymore.
I think you're right. And I don't think that can be the mindset any longer. We actually had 2 historic storms in 1 year. Helene with the flooding, well, with the storm surge, really. And then Milton was the rain and the flooding and the historic wind of the area. Now that has happened, the idea that we can say, oh, we're good, and check the box and say it's not going to happen for another 300 years is so silly. It's so silly.
Yeah.
Underground power is another interesting one. I know the Port of Tampa has received some federal funding to help with the project over there to bury and insulate some of their systems so they can keep operational during storms. Underground power to me makes so much sense. Whenever that was proposed at that time, was the roadblock costs and headache of bearing all the same excuses you have today for these infrastructure projects?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a cheap endeavor. You've got to rip up, infrastructure to get under there and all of that. And so, I get it. And a regulated utility doesn't have the ability to just say, we're going to spend this and then charge you. They have to get all the costs approved, and that's a difficult process for them. So I think, all of that became kind of a natural barrier. There were I remember some pretty rough fights with Florida Power and Light in the city of Coral Gables demanding undergrounding. And that battle went on for years to really sort of get to a shared solution. Because, if FPL can't make everybody in the state that's a ratepayer pay for the upgrades to the city of Coral Gables, right? Like it's these are cross municipalities and regions, and it's complicated, which is why we've got to all get on the same page.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for doing the show today. This was an awesome conversation, and I think it's the most important one we can have at this moment off the back of these storms. It's a really great time to settle in, understand where we're at, where we're going, and then, hey, we don't have to live this way. We can fight for a better future for our children, for generations to come. Things don't have to be the way they were. And it's okay. It's okay to learn. Like when people were building these bungalow homes like you live in, you're elevated, but a lot of people, it was just, hey, build a shack on in the coast in Florida. No big deal. We know better. We know better now.
Yep. And we have the opportunity to protect the Florida lifestyle. That's the moment that we are in. And we can't do it if we politicize it. We have to do it in a unified way.
Love it. If people want to reach out to you or follow your efforts, how can they find you?
Yep. So if you're spending a lot of time on Twitter, we're EDF_Florida on Twitter, or you can hit let's-tackle-climate-change-Florida.org. And then you can certainly just get more data and more information and some storytelling from floridasclimatefuture.org.
Beautiful. Environmental Defense Fund. Are you guys on social at all?
The mothership is. The Florida office doesn't have its own social media outside of Twitter.
And so you're the Florida office, and is this a nationwide or a global?
It's a global organization.
Organization, yep. Environmental Defense Fund. Fantastic. Very cool. Dawn, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone. See you next week. Hey, guys, if you want to watch episodes just like this one, make sure to click right here to view the rest of our full episodes. And also make sure to subscribe by clicking right here. Thank you for watching.